Thank you so much for joining us. It's awesome to see the turnout for this event, the registration, the questions people have sent. It's really exciting. So my name is Parzad. I work at the Harvard Brain Science Initiative, and joining us today are my colleagues Adam Sajak and Celia Muto. And all of us are really excited to welcome you. Today's event is So You Want to Be a Neuroscientist? It's a talk on this book by Professor Ashley Juavinett. And before we get started, I wanted to say a couple words about the group we're co-sponsoring this with. Our group, the Harvard Brain Science Initiative, is working along with BIPOC Neuro, a group started by 4 high school students in Texas at Pasadena Memorial High School. And that partnership has really been exciting for us. And it's chatting with each other that's kind of inspired us to have this event and to ask Dr. Juavinett to come and speak today. And so I just wanted to give the group a couple minutes to say hi. So the group was founded in 2020, last year. It was one of the few good things that happened that year. The founders are here today, Mahmoud Sadeghi, Adrita Rahman, Amy Nguyen, and Alexa Cavazos. So we're really excited to have you guys here. And the name, as the name suggests, the group advocates for the representation of Black, Indigenous, and people of color in neuroscience, particularly women and particularly the LGBTQ plus community. With that, I'll just give Mahmoud a few minutes to say hi.
Hi guys, thank you so much for coming, and I can't wait for y'all to enjoy this wonderful presentation and learn more about neuroscience. My name is Mahmoud Sadeghi. I'm a 17-year-old senior from Pasadena Memorial High School here in Texas, like South Texas. My interest in neuroscience has allowed me to learn more about fields like computational neuroscience, developmental research, and like behavioral neuroscience. And like with BIPOC Neuro, my friends and I who started this organization really want to like bridge the gap between minorities and the world of neuroscience to like diversify the field of this subject. And so now more than ever, we like are trying to use the internet to connect with others and gain access to opportunities that maybe we wouldn't have had access to before. And so with that, we hope to allow for equal access to such resources in order to promote like inclusivity, all of which tie into our 3 foundational pillars of diversity, inclusivity, and limitless potential.
Thank you so much, Mahmoud. With that, I guess we'll get started. So it is our great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Juavinett. Professor Ashley Juavinett is an assistant teaching professor at UCSD. She also co-directs a BSMS and START Neuro program there. She's from my home state, New Jersey, and she went to college at Lafayette College in Pennsylvania, where she, as an undergraduate, studied neuroscience and also minored in anthropology and sociology. She then received her PhD from UCSD. She worked in the lab of Ed Callaway, where she was studying the cells and circuits in the mouse visual cortex. She then did a postdoc at Cold Spring Harbor Labs with Ann Churchland, looking at innate behaviors in mice and freely behaving mice. And then she started this professor job in 2018. And this book that she's going to tell us about today is her first book. So she's also an author. The book is fantastic, and I'm really glad that we have her here today. And as I was reading about her more to prepare this bio, I learned that she's very multi-talented. She's also a singer-songwriter. If you go on her website, she has some great music. We're really lucky to have her as a speaker. And just as we get started, just a couple of housekeeping things. So for those of you signed in early, you might have heard us talking about it. We're really grateful for the questions. Like people have submitted 168 questions as people are registering. So, I think that all of them won't be covered in the talk, but we have lots of discussion time. So we just ask that you raise your hand or put it in the chat box, and we will call on you. Everyone is muted right now, but when we call on you, we can unmute you. With that, I think we can get started.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me and for inviting me. I'm beyond stoked to be here. And I can't believe you figured out that I'm a singer-songwriter. That's a topic for another time. Don't go too far down the rabbit hole of those old recordings. Yeah, so today my book talk is titled An Honest Look at an Evolving Field and Your Place in It. So really what I want to do is describe what I think neuroscience is, where I think neuroscience is heading, and what I think the next stage of neuroscience is going to ask of you as a student, and really sort of give you some tips, I hope, to help you join our field. So I wanted to start today by telling you a little bit about where I'm coming from. So this is me as a small child. I come from a family, a working class family, as Parizad said, in New Jersey. And these are some of my beginnings as a quote unquote scientist. Certainly curious, but really having no idea what science really was. My parents aren't scientists. My dad worked at the library for many years, and my mom is a daycare provider. And so I come from a non-academic background. Even when I said I wanted to be a scientist at some point, I really didn't know what that meant. So I'm sharing that because I think you don't need to come from a non-scientist background. And in fact, many, many people in the field do not. So you're welcome here. I decided to pursue neuroscience for a few different reasons. One of them was that I grew up with a sort of background of various mental health challenges. This is my grandmother. She struggled throughout her whole life with really, really crippling depression and anxiety, but she was also incredibly creative, as you'll see here. And so for me, this was one of the big motivators, was to try to understand, what was happening, and how can someone who struggles so deeply also do such beautiful things. When I was a high school student, I took one of those quizzes that said something along the lines of, what career do you want to pursue? And that led me to this book. It recommended this book called Mind Wide Open. And this, at the time, really opened my eyes, I think, to what neuroscience was, and is at this point kind of outdated, but at the time was a really interesting introduction to the field. And this writer, I highly recommend, Stephen Johnson, is one of my favorite nonfiction writers still today. So now I am doing a couple of different things. So I graduated with a degree in neuroscience from my undergraduate, and then I went on and did a PhD, and then a postdoctoral fellowship, which is some additional training after a PhD. And the focus of that was really to try to understand the cell types and circuits underlying visual perception. So really trying to understand different cell types in the brain, how they talk to each other, and how that ultimately allows us to see the world. Now I'm doing something slightly different. So I am actually a teaching professor. And so that means I do a combination of teaching and writing. So writing this book was a big part of that. So today we're going to talk a lot about neuroscience as a field, and presumably you're here because you're interested in neuroscience. So very first question that I have for you actually is, what is neuroscience? So if you want to just sort of sketch out a definition and put that in the chat, go ahead and do that now. We'll just kind of get a sense from people who are here what you think neuroscience is. So what is neuroscience?
So don't be shy, people. Let's see.
Awesome. So I see a few things. So I see the study of the brain, the study of how the central nervous system and peripheral nervous system interact with the body and the external world, brain, behavior, processes. Awesome. Yeah, lots of really good ideas here. Yeah, even like endocrinology, right? So it's not just, molecules and biology. Sometimes it intersects with all these other systems, definitely. Yeah, so I usually ask my students this as well when we start the quarter. And according to about 100 of those students, it's a variety of different things, many of the same things that you said here. So it involves neurons, it involves physiology. There's even a little bit of maybe psychology and behavior in here. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to add a couple of words to this word cloud. And I'd like to add new, because it's a really new field, relatively speaking, and also interdisciplinary, which I think is really obvious from the variety of different words that you see here. So I wanted to give you just a brief history of neuroscience to really underscore the point that this is a very new field. So it wasn't until the late 19th century that we really had a reasonable way to look at the nervous system. And of course, looking at something is very, very important for understanding what it does at all. And it was that development of the Golgi method, this a way that we could actually see neurons, that led Santiago Ramón y Cajal to say, I think the nervous system is made of these things called neurons. And Santiago Ramón y Cajal drew all these beautiful drawings. Here you can see a couple of Purkinje cells. And he started really establishing this idea that the nervous system was made of a bunch of neurons that were probably talking to each other, and really sort of set that up. It wasn't until the early 20th century, so 1929, that we really had our first recording from a nervous system at all. And then about 10 years later, we got our first intracellular recording of an action potential. And if you've ever taken a class on neuroscience, you've probably seen a diagram that looks something like this. So this is sort of the canonical textbook diagram of an action potential, where you have this rising phase and a falling phase and a hyperpolarization afterwards. And that textbook diagram is directly based on the work that was done in the 1940s and 50s. And what they did was they stuck an electrode into a axon and recorded from it and got an idea of what the nervous system was doing. And then people started developing more and more techniques to understand the nervous system. So in the 1970s, we figured out a way to actually record from single ions in the membrane. And that helped us understand the ions that were involved in generating the action potential. And then once you get to the 1990s, people started thinking there's probably more than one cell type. So there's not just one neuron. It's not like the brain is a homogeneous mass of neurons. There's probably about 1,000 different cell types in there, and they're probably all doing very different, interesting things. And that was a real sort of wake up call for neuroscience, because it's not really very simple at all. I'll point out too that this is also the very first fMRI image. So it was really the first time we were able to see the human brain in action. And then finally, once you get to the early 2000s, we start having techniques like optogenetics, the ability to genetically engineer organisms like transgenic mice. And that's the thing that's really sort of brought us to 2021 and the kind of neuroscience that we can do today. So really, we're a pretty new field. Like, if you're being generous, you might say we started really in the 1950s and 60s as we started getting a sense of what single neurons were doing. And it's been evolving ever since then. Santiago Ramón y Cajal, when he was writing about the field, he was seeing the complexity already. And I love this quote, because he says, the complexity of the nervous system is so great, its various association systems and cell mass is so numerous, complex, and challenging that understanding will forever lie beyond our most committed efforts. And I love this because it's not very optimistic, but you kind of understand, because in the early 1900s, we didn't have a way to study the brain. We couldn't even record a single action potential at that time. And so Ramón y Cajal is looking at all of his brain slices, looking at how complex everything looks, and saying, look, sorry, don't even try, because we can't do it. And for me, the kind of person that I am sees this, and I take it as like an immediate challenge, right? No, we have to figure it out. So as I hope I've sort of emphasized, neuroscience has changed dramatically since Ramón y Cajal. And Ramón y Cajal wrote a book in the early 1900s talking about his view in neuroscience. And not only has it changed technologically, but it's changed culturally as well. If you dive into this book, you'll find marital advice. You'll find advice on, how to like lead your life as an investigator, which of course at this time was mostly straight white men, of course. So things have changed quite a bit. And one of the goals that I had really for the book that I wrote was to try to say, look, there's a different field now. We need different people involved. But there are some really, really good pieces of advice in this book as well. So I don't want to wash it out completely. So one of the things that's really true is that neuroscience spans many levels of investigation. So you could be a neuroscientist who's investigating genes and molecules and channels, and really in the nitty-gritty of like, what are things opening and closing, which genes are being upregulated or downregulated, and trying to understand how that changes neural activity. Or you could be a neuroscientist that works at the level of neurons and circuits and systems, trying to understand what single neurons are and how they talk to other neurons, and maybe ultimately how that leads to something like behavior. Or you could be someone up here just trying to understand cognition and decision-making and more behavioral type things. So there's a whole different sort of slew of things that neuroscientists can look at, and they all fall in slightly different titles. And so I like to point this out because I think, you know, as you're starting your career and you're looking at like different programs or different internships and different departments, and they all have these various names like behavioral neuroscience and genomics and cellular, know that, you know, they're overlapping. So there's, you know, different fields here. They're not totally separate. And really neuroscience is all of these things. It's also interdisciplinary in the fact that we study a variety of different things, of different systems, different conditions, et cetera. So this is a cool plot, which is all of the abstracts submitted in 1 year for the Society of Neuroscience meeting, which is this huge meeting where people go and talk about their research. It's like 30,000 neuroscientists every year, if you can even imagine that many neuroscientists. They probably couldn't change a light bulb if they tried. But you can see here that there's a ton of different topics, right? So we're studying things like Alzheimer's disease, synaptic plasticity, even things like thirst and water balance. There's a ton of different topics here, and all of these fall under neuroscience. So if it intersects with the nervous system in one way or another, it's neuroscience. So as you're looking at the field, I think this is kind of a little bit overwhelming, but I hope it can also be exciting because you can look at this and say, you know, you might plug into any one of these sort of topics on this chart. So one of the things I want to do is talk about where neuroscience is heading, because, you know, by the time you graduate, or maybe 5 years from now, neuroscience might look a little bit different. So I'm going to play a little bit of forecaster, just trying to figure out, you know, where I think the field is going. And there's a lot of sort of things we can use as indicators of where the field is going. And one of them is the report from the Brain Initiative. So this is the 2025 report. So this is kind of looking forward to 2025 to see, okay, where do we need the field to be? And they point out a few different things. So they say we need more training in quantitative neuroscientists. So that means we need to have theory and statistics classes for biologists. And on the other hand, we need to expose physicists and engineers and statisticians to neuroscience. So we need this crosstalk. And I'm going to come back to this at the end of the talk. We also need teamwork. So in order to sort of make this work, this combination of computer science and biology, we need close collaborations between people that collect data and the people that think about the data and develop theories based on the data. And then finally, we need infrastructure for sharing tools. So we need this democratic access to data, to protocols, to everything that makes neuroscience work. That needs to be open, and it needs to have a clear infrastructure. And so the Brain Report lays out a lot of these different things. So I'm going to sort of summarize this in 3 main chunks. So the first thing is there's a lot of technological innovation happening. And related to that, data sets are getting much, much bigger. So one of the first things we can look at is the spatial and temporal resolution of neuroscience methods. And what I mean by that is the temporal resolution being, you know, how close in time can we actually understand something? So can we see it happening in milliseconds, or can we only see it happening on the order of minutes? On the other hand, we can think about spatial resolution. So can we see individual synapses, or are we limited to only seeing brain areas or nuclei? And what you're looking at here are many different techniques in neuroscience that are used. And the thing that I want to point out to you is what this map looks like in 1988 versus today. So you can immediately see it's much more dense today. We have several new techniques which have really sort of changed the playing field quite a bit for neuroscience. And 2 of those are things that I've pointed out before. So one of them is optogenetics, which is the ability to change single neurons in the brain, turn them on and off. And the second thing is fMRI, which is the ability to image different brain areas while a human is awake and doing various tasks. And both of those things have really changed our ability to understand the brain. There's also been a really large increase in the number of neurons we can record from. And so this is just a little sort of timeline similar to the one I showed you before, where we're looking at, you know, the sort of progression of recording technology over time. So in 1960, we were just sticking single electrodes into neurons, sort of trying to understand what single neurons were doing. In 1980, researchers started bundling these wires together to understand what maybe a brain area was doing. And then this just grows and grows until we have these things called Utah arrays and polytrodes, and now they're called neuropixels, and ultimately calcium imaging, which allows you to see a whole field of cells that are all fluorescing and active all at once. And you can actually plot this. So you can look at the publication date. So this is 1960. So again, kind of like the beginning of the field, the first time we really started recording from neurons. And then we can look all the way up to 2020, And you can see that the number of recorded neurons is changing year after year and continuously growing. And in fact, the number of neurons doubles every 6 years. So every 6 years, we can record from twice as many neurons as 6 years ago. So that's really amazing. And it means that every 6 years, we can ask dramatically different questions, because the ability to ask what 1,000 neurons is doing at one time is really different than the kinds of questions you can ask from what 1 or 2 neurons is doing at the same time. So this is one of my favorite videos to show, because this is the very first time, really, we've been able to see an entire brain all at once doing something at single neuron resolution. So this is a zebrafish. The zebrafish is looking to the left. And this is a technique called calcium imaging. So what they do is they put this indicator into cells that gets brighter whenever calcium is in the cell and whenever it's active. So these little balls that you see are cells that are more or less active depending on the moment in the video. So zebrafish is sitting there thinking it's zebrafish thoughts, and all of these neurons are firing, doing different things. Of course, trying to figure out what they're actually doing and why and when exactly is the next challenge. So we need to take all of this data and figure out, what single neurons are correlated with other neurons and across what brain areas, and what is the zebrafish doing during that? And that's really the next sort of challenge for neuroscience. Notice this is only 2013, so this is not that long ago. So as a result of the increase in technology, neuroscience data is also getting much, much bigger. So for example, if you take one mouse brain, which is about 500 millimeters cubed, and you assume that each of those single neurons in that brain make 1,000 different connections, which is a pretty reasonable assumption, you get a connection matrix between all of those neurons that's about 10 to the 11th. And if you sort of make some consideration for how much it takes to store that kind of data, that's about a few hundred gigabytes. Okay, let's say you image all of those neurons, or that whole brain, and you do it at a sort of reasonable resolution for today. Well, that's 500 petabytes of data. And if you record from every pixel in that brain for 20 minutes at 1,000 hertz, let's say, that's also 500 petabytes of data. So this is an insane amount of data, much more than a single photo on your phone, probably more than phone storage will ever be, right? This is crazy amounts of data. One of the efforts that I think is really cool that works on data of this size is this effort called iWire. And you can actually log on to iWire and play around with some of this data. So this is electron microscopy data, another fairly new technique. And they're imaging the retina of a mouse at insane resolution, where we can actually see individual synaptic boutons on a dendrite here. Individual dendritic spines on a dendrite here. So that's really, really amazing. And this is the first time we've had data at this resolution, but the data is really, really big. The other thing that's getting big is behavior. So, there's been a lot of sort of increase in technology in the past 10 years, and people have sort of had to course correct, because we got so obsessed with how many neurons we were recording that people argue that we started forgetting about behavior, right? Because in the end, a brain has to guide behavior in some way. And that's the thing that we really care about. But behavior is also getting bigger and really cool. So here's an example of a lab that actually studies bats. And they put these tiny recording devices on the bats as they're flying different trajectories. And so what they do is they look at things like spatial navigation and spatial memory as the bats are flying. And they're able to see things like spikes while the bats are flying around. So now we're able to do things like record from behaviors in animals in their sort of natural environment. And that's the first time we've ever been able to do that. This is a quote that I really like from the researcher behind this, that he says, "My worry has always been that by controlling too much, we might be restricting the very thing that we're trying to understand, behavior. There's mounting evidence that once you let the animal conduct more natural behaviors, you find surprising things about the brain." So one of the things that neuroscience is really doing right now is trying to understand the brain in its natural environment. What happens when you let a bat fly around and meet other bats? What's going on in the brain then, rather than reducing everything into a sort of experimental paradigm? So the last thing that I want to tell you about where neuroscience is heading is more collaboration. And that's largely a result of these first two things, because with more and more technology, with bigger data sets, we need more collaboration across labs. And there's a really, really numerous examples of neuroscience being collaborative and in really clever ways. So there's this institute up in Seattle called the Allen Institute for Brain Science. And they're kind of this really interesting model for doing science at scale. There's also the International Brain Laboratory, which does, as it suggests, neuroscience across international boundaries, which is really kind of amazing. And then there's lots of big projects to either map the brain, like the Human Connectome and the Human Brain Project, or Brain Minds, which is in Japan. And here's an example too of a Simon's collaboration that is based on trying to understand aging and what happens when the brain ages. So there's all kinds of really cool collaborations that are happening. One thing that I think is really rad as well is that the number of internationally collaborated articles is growing over time. So this is the percentage of total research output publication year, and this is how many of those articles are international. So have authors from different places, and you can kind of map out like who collaborates with who. But you can see that slowly but surely over time, this is actually increasing. However, most of the neuroscience research is still done in Europe, the US, and the UK. So this is a chart of all of the world citations in Elsevier by publication year, and you'll notice US and Europe largely leading the pack here. So people have been worried a little bit that as neuroscience sort of gets bigger, what happens if everything sort of is like big scale neuroscience and, we let it lose traditional labs? But I think that there's room and necessity for both types of science. So the future of neuroscience has traditional labs where you have, one faculty member or principal investigator who leads the lab, and they have a small group of people, as well as some of these bigger efforts, which are really sort of networks of labs across even international boundaries. So the second half of the talk, I really want to talk about what does this mean for you, an aspiring neuroscientist. I wonder if maybe it's a good time to sort of pause and take some questions.
Yes, if anyone has questions, please raise your hands or type them in the chat box. Okay, we have, let's see. Ray? Let's see. So in the chat box, we have a question for Maya. Any advice about navigating yourself in the job market?
I think I'll come back to this at the end, actually, because I'll talk a little bit about careers. So maybe I'll hold that one for later, but that's good to know. Yeah.
Let's see more ones in the chat.
There is another question by Spencer. If you could answer one question currently unanswered in the neuroscience field, what would it be?
This is a really good question. I think this might sound a little bit random, but it might be about how anesthesia works, because we really actually don't know how anesthesia works. It's kind of crazy. If you've ever had anesthesia, they like put a mask on your face and then like 2 seconds later you're unconscious, and we don't really know how it works. And I think that knowing how it works would have really interesting implications for things like understanding consciousness, right? Because you go unconscious, and so it does something to your consciousness. It's a really tough thing to study, but I think it's pretty fascinating. Also dreams are cool, weird, but hard to get an animal model of dreaming. So it's been hard to study. Oh, okay, now there's a lot of questions. I don't know if you guys want to bet these.
Yep. Let's see. Mahmoud, do you guys want to go, or should I just go ahead?
I can take this one and then they'll ask some. The next one is, what sort of interdisciplinary work have you found yourself doing that surprised you?
Oh, that's a good question. So yeah, when I was in college, so actually in the introduction, you mentioned that I was an anthropology and sociology major. So I've always been really interested in sort of sociology issues. And so when I was a senior in college, I made an earnest attempt to sort of combine sociology with neuroscience. And what I did was I did a study where I did eye tracking and what's called galvanic skin response, which is kind of like what they use for a lie detector test, right? So if you are lying or you have more adrenaline, you tend to sweat more, or just if you're having an emotional response, you tend to sweat more. And so I use these two techniques to try to understand if different things happened when people looked at different crime scenes, actually. So the idea being that we know the justice system is really biased, and maybe there's something sort of physiologically that's different when people are looking at crime scenes with different races of offenders. And so I think that this was really interdisciplinary, and it was just kind of really interesting, I think, to look at. And there's some really interesting research sort of at that intersection, really truly, of sociology and neuroscience. And yeah, so that would be something I worked on that I think is interdisciplinary.
Cool. So another
Okay.
question. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Ray asked, he was going to ask, how would you help with the replication crisis, but keep costs and ownership of intellectual data fair?
Yeah, I think that Ray is pointing to a really big thing which is happening right now, which they're referring to the replication crisis, which is really this problem with, papers get published, and then oftentimes other people try to replicate what they did, and it's really, really hard. And sometimes it's just because it's hard to replicate things. Other times it's because they did the experiment wrong, or inaccurately portrayed what they did, et cetera. So I think that's a big problem. One thing I'm really optimistic about is data sharing in general. And so with data sharing, the idea is that you can share all of your data, even just the raw data, and other people can try to do the same analyses and then do different analyses. And I think in the end, that's really going to change the way we do science, this sort of open access data science. And so a lot of the collaborations I mentioned just a minute ago go by this model where they share all of their data, and then anybody can dive in and try to replicate it. And so I think that hopefully will address things like the replication crisis. And it can actually, I think, keep sort of costs down as well, because if you're a theoretical neuroscientist, for example, and you have a particular question and there's an open data set that could address your question, then you don't have to go about, trying to find someone to partner with to get that data. You actually already have it. So in a way that can change the sort of cost model of neuroscience as well.
Okay, there was another question in the chat by, I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but Dana. They asked, are there any of these big collaborative neuroscience labs like the Allen Institute that are geared towards cognitive neuroscience?
That's a really great question. So things like, the Human Connectome Project, I think in a way you can think about as being cognitive neuroscience, because they're collecting a lot of data. In addition to, getting people's connectomes, they're collecting a lot of data about the age of those people and whether or not they have any sort of, neuro differences from other people. So in a way, that's a data set that tells us a bit about cognition and connectivity. So I think that's one answer. Beyond that, I can't think of any that immediately come to mind, but if I think of any more, I'll drop it in the chat. There's definitely data sets about cognitive neuroscience, but maybe not huge, big collaborations like this. There's a couple, I'll mention too, actually, there's a couple really cool projects to pull data across papers. So for example, there's this tool that I really like called Neurosynth. So if you go to neurosynth.org, and what that does is it basically looks at many fMRI publications, and it summarizes the data. So for example, if you're interested in decision making and you put in a decision making sort of into their search, it'll show you all the papers that have found brain activation related to decision making. And then it'll you can also do a reverse search, so you can like point at a part in the brain and say, what does this part of the brain correlate with? And so that's kind of a cool tool that will help you do cognitive neuroscience research, but not necessarily like a big collaboration.
Did you want to keep reading the questions or save some of them for the Q&A in terms of like your presentation?
Oh, I can maybe continue with the presentation and then we can come back to the questions. How does that sound?
Perfect, that sounds perfect.
Awesome. Okay, so yeah, so the second half here really is, what does all this mean for you as someone who maybe wants to go into neuroscience? And the very first thing I want to say is that neuroscience research can really take many different forms. It is like the most complicated Pokemon you can imagine. So, here's me in grad school. I'm doing calcium imaging. So this is kind of one form. I look at a computer a lot, I do surgery. I use genetic tools to try to see cells that are, see cells in action. You could be someone, on the other hand, who works with humans. So you could use something like EEG to understand what humans are doing during decision making or memory tasks, etc. You could be someone who does a lot of electrophysiology. So you could record spiking activity. You could be looking at a microscope all day. You could be working with different organisms. So you could work with C. elegans or maybe mice. Or you may never look at an organism at all. So you could be a computational neuroscientist who works with computers all day and never has to touch a mouse at all. So there's a ton of different ways in which neuroscience research kind of plays out. But regardless, I think that there's a couple things to think about as you're preparing for a career in neuroscience. So the very first thing and most important thing is to get research experience. And you could do this as an undergraduate at your current institution. And if you feel like you need a little bit more after your undergraduate, you can get more by doing like a post-baccalaureate position, or just sticking around as a tech in the lab, as a lot of people will do. But the main thing is really, before you really go into a PhD program, to think about getting at least a year, ideally more, of research experience. The second thing is to learn how to code. And this kind of comes from the idea that neuroscience data is getting bigger and more complex, and we really need people who know how to work with it. And I'm really not the first person to think so, or the only person who thinks so. So there's a variety of different papers that different researchers have published that say, like, look, students really need quantitative skills. They need scientific programming. This is going to be really important for dealing with large scale data, et cetera. So why do you maybe need to learn how to code? The very first thing is data acquisition. So a lot of labs program their own tools to be able to do different things in the lab. So to control specific types of hardware, to acquire images, et cetera. If you walk into a lab at your respective university or city, you might find these like little boxes called Arduinos. And these are little programmable boards, basically, which you can make to do a number of things. And many labs use them because they have sort of custom tasks that they need their experiment to do. The next thing is statistics, data analysis, and visualization. Especially as data gets more and more complex, things like Excel really don't cut it when it comes to trying to visualize the data and run statistics on it. And so coding can help with this tremendously. If you want to do computational modeling, as I mentioned earlier, of course, most of that is built on coding. So that is also really important. And beyond research, there's really more and more jobs for software engineers and data scientists, and they pay more. So learning how to code, will probably help you in research, but it will also open a lot of doors for other careers. So many times people wonder, okay, where do I start, right? So what programming language do I start with at all? And I think there's a couple answers to that. Really, there's no wrong answer, but I think there's a couple of considerations. So one thing is the entry cost. So how much does it cost to use that tool, right? And MATLAB is commonly used by neuroscientists, but it is also very expensive. So if your university doesn't have a license for it, it's basically off the table. On the other hand, tools like Python are completely free, and R as well, also completely free. You can also learn them online. There's a lot of free online courses and things like that, which you can at least sort of get started with. And they also have low conceptual entry. So they're written basically in English. So if you're an English speaker, that can sort of ease your entry into the language. And so Python and R, I think, are a really good bet if you're just getting started. So you might think, I am scared of coding, or I'm not a coder, I'm not a math person. But I want to tell you that you don't need to be a quote unquote math person in order to learn how to code. And in fact, I ran a survey of a bunch of different neuroscientists, and I asked them, how comfortable did you feel working with code at this point in your career? And as an undergraduate, or maybe in their postbac, most people said not at all or very little. And so I really want to stress that if you haven't taken a coding course yet, it's not too late. I learned in grad school, many scientists learn in grad school, so there's still plenty of time if you'd like to learn, or at least try learning coding. So sort of related to this, I would get some practice wrangling and visualizing data. And this is a quote from a researcher that I really like that says, "This is where the hard work is in formulating precisely the question of what we actually want to know, what an answer would look like, and what kind of insight we can take away from the experiment." So it's not only like the logistics of working with data and getting in the format you need, but also knowing what kinds of questions you should ask and sort of formulating those questions. And so thinking about data in this way is something that I would try to get some practice with. And there's a few different ways you can get practice with this. So as I mentioned before, there's a lot of neuroscience data sets that are publicly available. Here's a list that I put together. If you go to this link here, bit.ly/open neuro datasets, you'll find a whole spreadsheet of open datasets that people have made available. Some of them are in this format called Neurodata Without Borders, which is a file format that a lot of neuroscientists are trying to use now. The Allen Institute for Brain Science also has a lot of open data. And in parallel, you could do things like take an online class for free, or one that you maybe have to pay a nominal fee for, or a class at your university, or something like Neuromatch Academy, which is actually a free online course in, or very, very low cost online course in computational neuroscience and a little bit of data science too. The next thing is to lead and collaborate. And I have been so impressed by BIPOC Neuro. I think you guys are awesome. And I think you're doing exactly this, right? You're collaborating with other institutions. You're sort of leading this effort for something that you care about. And this is helping you prepare for a career in neuroscience and really any number of different careers. So one of the things I also did as a part of this survey was try to understand what skills neuroscience professionals are using in their careers. And so I asked about things that you might suspect, right? So I asked about bench skills, like you have to work with a microscope or image or do surgeries. And, you know, not surprisingly, people that are applied industry scientists or faculty doing research, they say that they use these skills quite a bit. Similarly, coding is also really, really prevalent in a lot of different careers, even consulting a little bit. Data analysis, also really, really important. But then the thing that really stood out to me when I did this survey was that basically everybody, regardless of career path, said that managing a team and communicating with a team was incredibly important. And you'll notice that the scores here are higher than for any other category here. So if you're getting some practice leading a group, collaborating with others, communicating, so that means, you know, giving presentations or writing, all of that is super important regardless of what career you end up pursuing in the end. The next thing is to know that there are many paths forward. So as I hope I've pointed out, neuroscience is really, really varied. And that means that there's a lot of different ways to get into it and go through it. So one of the big questions I often get is, you know, what should I major in order to get into neuroscience? So I've asked many people, so there's two different surveys here, one's on Twitter, one's that survey I alluded to before. And of people that are sort of in neuroscience research, their undergrad degrees are in a variety of different things. So some of them have neuroscience degrees, some of them have psychology or biology, but then there's also a whole host of other things like engineering, computer science, medicine. There's even some answers that are like literature and music. So really you could major in almost anything. Most people tend to major in things like psychology and biology. Of course, after you get your undergraduate degree, you might consider doing a PhD, and a PhD opens a lot of doors for different careers. But it's good to think really carefully about doing a PhD. But I want to know from you, what do you think about doing a PhD, and sort of what are your perceptions about the PhD path? So you can go ahead and put those in the chat maybe. Awesome, someone's starting their PhD. Congrats. It's not for the faint of heart. Hard work, but rewarding. Awesome, many people getting started. Congrats. It's scary, intimidating. Oh, expensive. I'm really glad someone said expensive, because PhD programs in neuroscience and in most STEM fields will actually pay you a stipend. So you don't pay for grad school. So that's a really important thing to know. And for me, when I was graduating from college and trying to think about next steps, you know, coming from a working class family, I wasn't ready to pay for any type of schooling really. So knowing that a PhD actually paid me a stipend made a huge difference. So That's a good thing to know. There is an opportunity cost, right? Because you could be working at a company potentially, but the PhD in itself does pay some money. So it's good to know that. It's very research heavy. Yeah, so that's a really good point. And someone said that it's about 5 years long. And yeah, so 5.5 years is the average for PhD programs in the United States in terms of their length. So 5.5 years is kind of what you need to set aside. And the stipends just come with the graduate program. So if you look online, most graduate programs will tell you how much they pay. Yeah, and it is nice to have a doctor title. Although I always worry about getting on a plane and saying that I'm a doctor, because I don't want to be that PhD who gets asked, is there a doctor on the plane? That'll never happen, but it's just, I'm not qualified to do anything like that. And some people do finish their PhD in less than 5.5 years. So I finished in 5. I have some colleagues that finish in 4.5. It's possible. 5.5 is the average. So okay, awesome. I think I have a sense of where you guys sit then. So I see there's some other questions here, so maybe we can come back to those at the end. One of the things that students often say is a PhD is really hard. And I would say yes, but so is what you're doing right now, especially learning online during a pandemic. PhD is hard, but it's hard for different reasons. So unlike your time as an undergraduate where you're taking classes and you're studying hard and you're memorizing a bunch of stuff, that's really not what a PhD looks like. So a PhD is about a year of coursework and maybe some research rotations, depending on the program. And then after that, it's all research. So it's hard because it's self-motivated. You have to sort of come up with your schedule, decide what you're going to do, hopefully work with an advisor who can give you some mentorship and help you out. But really, really, it's very independent. And it can be a little bit emotionally taxing because there's no guarantee that experiments are going to work. So PhDs are hard, I think, for different reasons than undergraduate degrees are hard. But I really, truly believe that anybody can get a PhD who wants to get a PhD. So you might wonder, why get a PhD? Do I need to get a PhD? There's a few things that open up for you if you get a PhD. So if you want to lead your own lab at a university, you need to have a PhD. For many companies, if you'd like to be in sort of a lead scientist role, you may need a PhD for that. And in general, a PhD does sort of allow you to say, yes, I'm a scientist. So it gives you kind of a scientist stamp. If you ask neuroscience programs around the country, if their graduates are in these different industries, you'll find that most programs have people who have gone into biotech or pharmaceutical companies. And then they have people who have gone into universities as well as independent research institutes doing different types of research. So I wanted to point out one thing, which is the sort of difference between working in industry, so something like biotech or pharmaceutical company, versus working at a university. And this is often kind of broken down as the difference between industry research and academic research. And so there's a lot of considerations here, and I'm happy to talk about this more if people are starting to think about this really. But when people think about academic research, they think there's a lot of intellectual freedom. It's fairly predetermined. So you get a PhD, then you get a postdoc, which is that additional training, and then you can start your own lab. It's 10 years of not much money, but as I said, you do get a stipend as a PhD student. Work-life balance can be tough, but it depends on you and sort of how you manage your life. But if you want to do basic science research, like you would just like to know how an area of the brain works or what a protein does in a cell, and it's not directly linked to some sort of neurological disorder or treatment or whatever it may be, then really academic research is the main home for that kind of basic science research. It also can be a little bit geographically challenging. So as a postdoctoral fellow, when you're at that stage, you go in the job market and you're basically subject to what universities are hiring. And it's not as if every university in the US is going to be hiring, it's probably only 10 to 15 in your field. So you kind of have to decide if you're willing to move to those 10 or 15 locations. On the other hand, industry research, intellectual freedom depends a little bit on the company. So some companies like small, fast-moving startups will have a lot of intellectual freedom where you're really guiding projects. Other bigger companies may not have the same level of intellectual freedom. There's many different paths and positions. So people in industry are doing research, but some of them are in marketing, some of them are more in project management. So there's kind of a lot of more diversity there. Typically, folks in industry make more money. That's basically a rule. It's also more likely to be 9 to 5 working hours, But again, this does depend on the company. Like if you're at a startup and you're trying to get the next stage of funding, folks are going to be working much more than 40 hours a week. It also tends to be clinically oriented, as I said, because usually companies want to, find a drug target or develop a therapy. And some studies are better than others for industry, but in general, I think it's a little bit more geographically flexible. The thing that I really want to leave you with, though, is there's really endless possibilities and different combinations, and there's going to be jobs that in 5 years that don't exist today. So it's really impossible to sort of plan precisely for your career. And one of the things that I tried to do in the book, and actually was the most really enjoyable part of writing the book, was talking to different people. So I talked to a whole slew of people about their career paths. And the thing that's kind of cool to me is they don't really fit into boxes. People start doing one thing, they switch into a different career, they learn that they like this other thing. And so you can kind of see them wind through their careers because, you have a whole life ahead of you. There's many different things you could do, and there's many different combinations of different things that you can piece together to be happy. And so, so don't get caught up on one thing too much. So for me, there's a few boxes that I wanted to check for my career. And I think this is a good way to think about career planning, because you're going to have many different possible career paths that may check your boxes. And so doing it this way really allows you to be flexible about what the actual position is. So for me, the boxes I needed to check were, I wanted a place where my partner and I actually wanted to live. So I cared about where we lived, and that meant a lot to me. I wanted some degree of creativity and intellectual freedom. And so, that means I get to develop lectures now or do a lot of writing and sort of have some intellectual freedom with my research. So that was basically something that I really, really needed. And finally, I wanted a job where I could communicate about science to students or the public. So for me, that was, something like teaching or maybe even public policy or science writing. And so, yeah, it really is great to be able to do things like this and talk to you. And that's the note that I'll just leave this on for today. So thanks again. We can definitely talk about some more questions that I see here in the chat. This is the book. It's called So You Want to Be a Neuroscientist. You can find it on Amazon and all those good places. And here are some handles if you want to catch up later on social media.
Thank you so much for the fabulous talk. So I think for questions, if people raise their hands, I can call on them, and otherwise I'll let the BIPOC Neuro team read out questions from the chat. And we also have some questions saved from various registration forms. So if people want, I can kick it off. Okay, so one question I can kick it off with, and then maybe you guys can do ones from the chat, is what is one part of being a neuroscientist that no one ever told you about, something that caught you by surprise?
Oh, that's a really good question. Yeah, I think I'll turn this off because I'm gonna get distracted by my own. Yeah, I think one thing that, so coding for one, I had no idea that there was gonna be any sort of coding when I got into the lab, and in the end I ended up liking it. So, it wasn't a problem for me, but that's definitely not something I knew about in advance. I think the other main thing is, at least in the field of neuroscience that I was in as a PhD student and a postdoc, there's a lot of work with my hands that was very, very technical. So as a PhD student and a postdoc, I was doing these surgeries on mice because we wanted to essentially create a window into the brain. And in order to do those surgeries, you kind of have to be good with your hands. I mean, it's like neurosurgery on a mouse, right? So it's much, much smaller than normal human neurosurgery. And I didn't know that. And for some people that can be a little bit an issue, like if you don't have steady hands, right? Like even if I had coffee in the morning, my hands were shaking a little bit. So that's not something people often talk about, but it is a reality of doing research on small animals a lot of the time.
Thank you. I think that was a really interesting question. Really good points.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, there's a good point here too. Oh, sorry. I was gonna say Manny makes a really good point too, like making tools and there's actually a lot of like engineering in neuroscience. Like people are designing different things and sort of coming up with innovative strategies. Like we want the mouse to like lick left and then lick right. Okay, like what is it gonna lick? It's gonna lick like a little syringe. Okay, we're gonna cut off a syringe and then like put water through it. Like you have to sort of design a whole system to do your experiment. So absolutely maker skills, like 3D printing, all those kinds of things. Yeah. Sorry, Mamu.
Oh no, it's all good. I was just saying we can go to the forum and also in the chat. Hannah asked, how were you able to narrow down your interests and decide what topics you wanted to research?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For me as an undergrad, I was sort of bouncing around largely between sort of summer research opportunities. So I spent my first summer at Louisiana State University working with rats that had been actually exposed during development to opioids. And then our question was, do those rats actually respond differently to opioids as adults? So does that prenatal exposure change their tolerance later? And so that was my very first exposure and to research at all, really. And I thought, okay, I really like research. These are sort of interesting questions. Like I'm interested in drug addiction, all these things. And then a couple summers later, I did a molecular biology experience and didn't really like that, learned that I didn't like molecular biology. And then when I came back to my Lafayette and did my honors thesis, as I described earlier, which is kind of this mix of like sociology and neuroscience, I sort of just kept bouncing around between different areas of neuroscience. And I think it's actually through that, like getting different exposure to different things and saying, okay, like molecular biology is not it. I like sociology a little bit. I got to grad school, I did some neuroimaging, and because I thought that's what I wanted to do when I started grad school. And then I realized, well, if you do neuroimaging, the only kind of data you get back are like blobs of brain activity. And, for some people that's satisfying, and for some questions that's really satisfying, but I wanted to know what the neurons were doing and what the circuits were doing. And you can't do that in a human. So that means you have to go to mice. And so that's the thing that brought me to mice. So I think it's kind of just, like there's never like narrowing down, but it's rather kind of like bouncing around and looking at things and saying, I like that part of it and I don't like that part of it. And then so changing something and then doing the same process again of like, I like it and I don't like it, and then moving around the world that way. So I don't know. Yeah.
Okay, and we have another question from one of our participants. And they asked, what are some recent breakthroughs in neuroscience that have changed the way the field understands the brain?
Oh man, that's such a good question. I personally think a lot of the work right now around addiction and reward in the brain is really interesting. So using all of the sort of technical tools that I've described, we've been able to untangle some really interesting mechanisms in the brain for things like reward. And reward in one way seems really simple. And the thing, the sort of textbook thing you read is when you eat something you like or you do something you like, the brain releases dopamine and dopamine makes you feel good, right? And that's kind of like the story. But then, what happens with people who have addictions and their sort of sense of what feels good and what's good for them is changed, right? And using these molecular tools, we've been able to figure out areas like the lateral habenula are actually firing differently during different types of behaviors and with drug addiction and with depression. And those studies are actually directly informing treatment. So now we have treatments in humans where we use what's called transcranial direct magnetic stimulation to change the activity of those brain areas that have been implicated in some rodent studies. And so that's the stuff I'm really excited about, because I think there's this really clear sort of passage between, okay, we figured out something in rodents, we know that something's different about the way neurons are firing, let's test this in a human and see if we can actually treat addiction or depression or whatever it is that's kind of changing the reward system. So yeah, I think that stuff is really promising and interesting.
Okay, there is another question in the chat. and it's asking, what is your opinion on the debate regarding the use of animals for medicinal research?
This is a really good question, and it's really important. And it's something that so I did research on mice for my PhD, and then as a postdoc. And towards the end of my postdoc, I started really questioning, why are we doing this, and is it worth it? And I think that every researcher needs to ask themselves that question that's working with animals. And I think if you talk to them, most people have, right? And they sort of will tell you that it's worth it. I think it's absolutely worth it. I think we have to think carefully about, what models we use and why. And this is one of the reasons I care a lot about open data, because sometimes we might redo experiments that were already done. And if we only had access to the data from another lab, we might actually save, those 10 mice that we were going to use in the experiment. So by using the data from another lab. And so I think that that can help cut down on the amount of animals we need to use in research too. I'm also really excited about animal models that aren't mammalian. So, I'm actually working on this article about aging research, and people study aging in a variety of different animals, including like C. elegans worms. And there's this fish called the killifish, which lives for 2 months and then dies, and you can study aging in it. And so I'm excited about non-vertebrate animal models, because I think that they can actually answer a lot of questions, and then we can avoid the use of vertebrate animal models, which I think come with their own ethical complexity. So yeah. Yeah, but I think it's something that researchers need to talk more about, because you have to know, going into neuroscience research, that much of neuroscience research is done with animal models, and a lot of it is done with mice and rats, and even things like non-human primates. So yeah, it's a good thing to think about and know about.
Parazad, if you wanted to jump back to the spreadsheet.
Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. So there are a ton of great questions that we received. I think one that was interesting was just, what does your typical day look like, if you could describe, or your typical week, if it varies a lot,
Yeah, I suspect someone is asking this because they really want to know what research life is like. So I'll answer for that. And then I saw a question in the chat about not doing research, so maybe we'll kind of tie that in together. But as a researcher, I mean, one of the things I really liked about being a researcher was that you get to do a variety of different tasks. So when I was in my postdoctoral fellowship, I might have like 3 days a week where I am, doing a surgery. So that means a lot of working with my hands. And then I'm recording from a mouse while it does a task. So I might like plug the mouse into the recording system and get it going and sort of watch its behavior. So that might be sort of 2 days or 3 days a week. And then the other days of the week, I'm doing things like analyzing all that data. So as a postdoc, and Daniel's here, who did some research with me this one summer for this, we would do these experiments, we collect all this data, and then you have to spike sort it, because it's gigabytes and gigabytes of data. And so you'd spend 2 or 3 days a week just spike sorting. So sitting at a computer saying like, that's a real spike, that's not. And then doing some coding to make some sense of that. So, the animal was running around, and what are the neurons doing then? So yeah, as a researcher, for me, it was a mix of doing things with my hands, working with the animals, and then data analysis and coding. So maybe like 50-50. And of course, reading papers, having lab meetings and things like that. Yeah, it is fun. But yeah, I saw that someone asked about leaving research, because yeah, my job now is not that. So I'm a teaching professor, which means my job is primarily teaching. And for me, that made a lot of sense, because I never felt the urge to leave my own lab, which some people definitely do. I never really felt that. So I have always been drawn though to the tasks of sort of like, how do you explain research to someone? Or how do you write about this in a way that makes sense? And what do policymakers need to know? And all these different questions. And so I've always been drawn to that side of things. So when this job came up, I was super excited, because it is this mix of teaching, but also doing a little bit of research. And for me, I've been extremely, extremely happy in this mix of things.
Thanks. We had a ton of questions also about mentorship, and how do you select a good mentor? What are some qualities you would recommend looking for?
Oh man, yeah, I care a lot about this, and I think about this probably every day, because I think, for me, one of the most frustrating things that gets in the way of someone's career is having a mentor that doesn't help them, basically, or even gets in the way. And that's a huge problem in science, kind of regardless of where you are. So from the outset, I think something that's really, really important with finding a mentor, so let's say your primary research advisor, is one, talking to people that already work in their lab. So, whether you're looking for sort of a tech job, or once you are looking for a PhD lab, talking to people that are in their lab and asking them concrete questions. So not just like, are you happy in lab? Because most people will say, yeah, sure, I'm fine. But asking them concrete questions about, how often do you meet with your advisor? How long does it take for your advisor to respond to emails? How many times do you have lab meeting a year or a month or whatever it is? I think also things like, what happens when something goes wrong in the lab? Like, do you feel like you could tell your advisor when an experiment doesn't work? And those are the questions that'll really get people talking and will help you understand if an advisor leads an environment where people feel comfortable disclosing failures and experiments not working. Because guess what? Science doesn't work like 90% of the time. So that's super, super important. So I think really sort of sussing out things beforehand. And if you're already in a lab and maybe you're not happy with the advisor, something to think about is getting a sort of secondary advisor. So maybe it's another faculty who, you feel more comfortable with, you've taken a class with, just asking, can we get coffee, or asking for their advice on something. I think that can be really powerful. But yeah, I think that you should expect a certain level of involvement from your advisor. And even if they're hotshot in the field and they run a huge lab, it really doesn't matter. I think that if you work in a lab, you deserve a certain amount of mentorship. And so just know that, and know that there are plenty of people in neuroscience that want to mentor you. And so don't put up with anything less than that.
That's really great advice. Let's see. Do we want to go with more chat questions, Mahmoud?
Yeah, so Dominic had an interesting question. He said, since we were talking about technological advances in neuroscience, might you explain your opinion about brain-machine interfaces / neurointerfacing, and like merging AI and the human brain?
Yeah, I think I saw that too, and they mentioned Neuralink too. So I sort of show that like timeline of recording techniques, and one thing I want to point out is that Neuralink and sort of similar big idea neural interfaces are really sort of a continuation of that. So we do have the technology already to record from hundreds of neurons at a time. Of course, the next step, and the thing that like Neuralink and other groups want to do really, is have it be a feedback loop. So not only are you sort of recording behavior, but also it's an interface. So you can use that behavior to do something in the world, like read your email or whatever it may be. I think that stuff is really interesting. I think it's fun to talk about. I think it has some interesting implications for different neurological disorders when we think about kind of retraining the brain. But I guess the thing that I want to leave you with is that, none of that stuff is, I think, a sort of dramatic shift from the things that we already do, right? And it's an interesting extension, and we already use BMI to treat different disorders, at least sort of in an experimental setting. We sort of can do a little bit of that, and things like Neuralink get a lot of attention. It'll probably bring some money to neuroscience, so I won't complain about it. But in the end, I think we're already heading in that direction. I think there are some interesting things to come.
So one really great question we received as people were registering is just in different ways, people are asking, what's the best part of your job? What's the most rewarding? What's the most fun part of your job right now?
Yeah, for me right now, it's I have always been like a liberal arts dilettante person who likes to do many different things, I think. And so right now, the thing I like about my job the most is that I get to do a lot of different things on a daily basis. So whether that's teaching or writing, or you know, I do a bit of sort of data analysis of my own data, open data sets, and I kind of like the mix of things. And yeah, I really like to get to talk big picture and to work with, you know, students like all the people here.
And I guess while we're talking about that, what about the inverse question? Like, what's the hardest part of your job?
Yeah, I think, and I know there's a few faculty here, and maybe they'll sort of relate to this, like university politics. I just like usually don't want to deal with it. I don't want to have to think about tenure. I don't want to have to think about like specific rules for things. But of course, you know, I direct some programs on campus, and so I have to go into those rabbit holes. And yeah, I would just much rather think about, you know, brain machine interfaces. Every job comes with some level of, you know, politics, but though, basically.
Shall we go with more chat questions? There's tons of questions. I'm just trying to figure out how to prioritize.
Yeah, so excuse me if I'm not pronouncing this right. I think it's Ritika asked, what is the scope for neuroscience in biotech startups? And are there any emerging associations that you find especially interesting?
This is a good question. So I think of tech and sort of biotech really for neuroscience in sort of two worlds. And one world is, you know, tools for neuroscientists to do experiments. And so, for example, someone from my PhD program graduated, started a company making some of the fibers and parts for optogenetics at low cost. So they were doing like a lot of 3D printing. And so they kind of make the tools for neuroscientists to do their experiments. So that's kind of like one sort of biotech, if you will. But then the other side of course, like things like developing drugs and pharmaceuticals and treatments of different kinds. And this has been really hard in neuroscience. So like many big pharmaceutical companies have spent billions of dollars trying to, for example, develop drugs for Alzheimer's. And it turns out it is really, really hard, and things work in animal models and then they don't in humans, like once they get to that stage of testing. And so I think that, you know, it's going to be really interesting to see what comes out of sort of smaller startups in terms of developing those kinds of drugs and things like that. One thing that I guess I'm excited about along those lines is personalized medicine. So as I mentioned, depression and anxiety is rampant in my family, and something I recently learned about was this test where you can actually get your genome sequenced, and with considerable reliability, it can tell you what kind of antidepressants might work for you based on, you know, your levels of different receptors or whatever it may be. And that's the stuff I'm really excited about, because I think that in individual people's lives and in many, many people's lives who deal with things like depression and anxiety, that's going to make a huge difference. Because, you know, if you've ever gone on an antidepressant, you know that it takes several weeks for it to do anything. And then you have to kind of like suss out whether it's working. So if you can sort of from the get-go use genomics to understand if it's working or predict whether or not a certain antidepressant will work, that's going to make a big difference. So I'm really excited about personalized medicine along those lines. Yeah.
One interesting question from Sharon was, what advice do you have for people who are transitioning from non-traditional fields to neuroscience?
Yeah, that's a good question. So by non-traditional fields, I'm guessing you probably mean like not traditional in neuroscience. so not traditionally leading into neuroscience. Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is to get your foot in the door at a lab somewhere. And that might mean volunteering in the beginning. You know, maybe you can get a job as a tech washing dishes or doing something kind of simple in the lab, some sort of non-research task. But the main thing is to just get your foot in the door. So then you can see what kind of research is going on, and then maybe get into another position where you're actually like doing some of the research, you know, ultimately maybe getting your own project, working as a tech and things like that. So I would say, you know, look around in your area if there's a university nearby, or even like a biotech company nearby, or anything where you can get your foot in the door at some entry level. That's definitely a good step.
Yeah, and there was a question earlier that asked, would you recommend to bulk up grad school applications for someone who has limited experience? And is there anything that you'd recommend doing alongside working in a lab to make yourself more appealing?
Yeah, I mean, the main thing that most admissions committees for PhD programs are going to look at is they're going to say, really they're asking, is this person ready for grad school? Do they know what grad school is going to be like? Do they know what doing research is like? And the main thing that points towards that is, of course, just having research experience. There's a couple things around it. So getting a letter of recommendation from your advisor that really speaks to your motivation to go to grad school, really speaks to the agency that you took on whatever project it was, that can make a big difference. I don't think there's necessarily like extracurriculars. Maybe if you sort of take some coding classes or do some data analysis sort of on your own, like your own small projects, that's maybe something you can think about adding. But I would really think about how you talk about your experience in your app. So, you want to show that you understand the project, that you led a part of the project, that you had some agency. So it wasn't just like someone was telling you what to do and you did it, but rather you were really thinking about it and really involved in that way. And so, it's maybe not necessarily the amount of research always, but what quality that research was. And that's something that is really up to you to convey in your application. So I think I would think about that.
And then Ritika asked, as a professor, what do you think are the primary problems in science communication, especially in neuroscience?
Yeah, I care a lot about science communication. I mean, I think if there's anything we've learned from this pandemic, this is one of them, right? It's that communicating this stuff is really hard and it's really, really important. So I think there's one thing, and I'll just say this because I've been thinking about it recently, which is like, the how you communicate things depends on what your goals are and who you're talking to. So for instance, right now with all the vaccine stuff, a lot of scientists are caught up on there being different variants, or caught up on the fact that like, well, nothing is 100%, right? And as scientists, we're sort of trained to be super critical and say, nothing works 100%, it's not foolproof, etc. And those are really important things. But when it comes to sort of science communication for public health, the message needs to be vaccination is going to help us get through this pandemic and is a good thing. And that's a different message because you don't necessarily want people walking away feeling like, well, if it's not 100%, then why should I get vaccinated, for example? So that's a really tricky thing, but it's really important. And I personally really, really think that we need better science communicators in the world. And there's a couple of routes for this. So like if you get your PhD, for example, or even not, there's programs for science communication. I think those are incredibly important. And I think that, honing those skills, and it is not something that comes easy, honing the skills to talk about your research in a way that is clear and makes sense to the public, and also conveys why you're doing it to the public, is so, so important if we want to keep funding science, if we want to keep advancing public health and all of these things. So yeah, it's just really, really important.
Okay, and Porter asked, where do you think the field of neuroplasticity is headed?
That's a good question. It's not my field, but I'm guessing it is in the same place as a lot of fields right now, which is, trying to understand specific cell types, so what cell types in the brain change, how much do they change, how does this involve, how does it intersect with different neurological disorders or even just normal aging? All of these things are really big questions. So yeah, I don't know specifically, but I imagine sort of it's trying to get more specific in how we understand neuroplasticity, and then also trying to understand how it changes in different neurological disorders. I don't know if there's people here who do neuroplasticity research. They might have a better answer than that.
So the next question that is actually from our research teacher at Pasadena Memorial is from Dr. Peters. And he is wondering, as a professor, what do you wish your students would do or do more of to get the most out of their education and research experiences?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing is, and maybe I'm just saying this because we just talked about science communication, but I think talking to other people and sharing what you're doing as a researcher is really, really important. And that's something you can do in your own time. So if you start doing research in a lab, you can start a blog or like a Medium column, or even on social media, right? Share to the world what you're doing. And the reason for that is twofold. One, there's sort of this personal benefit of honing the skill of talking about what you do and really making that evident to other people. And two, there's the benefit of people seeing scientists in the world. And maybe you have friends from high school who see on social media that you're a scientist, and now you do aging or Alzheimer's research, and then they have sort of an idea of what a scientist looks like, right? Because we have this very biased idea of what scientists look like. And so if there's more people talking about their science in the world and honing their skills, I think that that's something anybody can do. And I would love to see more students and researchers set aside an hour a week to like write a blog post about what they did that week or why their research is important. And I think that that can be really impactful.
Yeah, and there was a question in the chat about, do you have any neuroscience podcast recommendations?
Oh, that's a great question. Neuroscience specifically. Oh, what is it called? Oh gosh, I'm totally blanking on the name. I'm sorry. Maybe I'll think of it. Yeah, I will tell you a non-neuroscience podcast that I love, which is called The Memory Palace. But I don't listen to a ton of like neuroscience podcasts. It's probably because I'm usually listening to a podcast to like take my mind off of things.
I know there's one.
Oh my gosh, what is it called?
There's one like that, and yeah, there are a few, but Brain Matters is pretty cool.
So I think we have
I'm
about
looking on my
5.
Spotify now.
I was just going to say, I think we have about 5 more minutes, so maybe we could take, 1 or 2 final questions. There was
Okay,
one in the chat that
sorry,
go ahead, please.
I was just about to read the one from the chat.
Yeah.
Is there something you wish you would have done alongside your PhD, maybe another program, internship, job, or personal virtue?
Oh, yeah, so I did a lot of things alongside my PhD, so I don't think I would have added another thing. I might have actually added more time in my PhD, so that's not quite an answer to your question, but it's probably the most honest answer for me. So during my PhD, I was also teaching, I was also doing a lot of science writing. Those things ended up being incredibly important for my own sort of personal development, but also figuring out what it was I wanted to do in the end. And so I mean, the main thing I want to say is if you have a side hustle, in addition to your research, that those things can be really, really important and definitely worthwhile. And they definitely were for me. So yeah, things like teaching, things like science writing, any sort of chance to like lead a student organization, like BIPOC Neuro or anyone at your university, all of those things are super important experiences. And the podcast is called Invisibilia. I had to look it up.
Do we want to do one final question?
Yeah, if you have time, there are like really 2 good questions from Stephen and Ray. Ray asked, as like LGBTQ plus / BIPOC, How can people make the workplace more equitable and raise less heard voices?
Yeah, this is a really good question. It's really important. So there's a few things. I think, the one thing is like, if you're an undergrad or a grad student, one thing to recognize is that you actually have a lot of power here. So you have power to be an example for other people, to be an example of a scientist, and to put pressure on people that make policy decisions about these kinds of things, whether it's admissions and who gets in, or diversity fellowships, or whatever it may be. So, one of the first things is to just recognize that you have power, probably more than you think. The second thing is that I think things like admissions and all of those discussions and sort of the gatekeeping mechanisms that science has. So it starts with admissions, it goes to things like tenure and publication. Each of these things matter, and not one person can tackle all of them. However, identifying maybe one thing, like you notice your graduate program is, pretty white, and you email the person who is sort of running the graduate program, or who's on admissions, or someone you consider an ally, and you say, like, look, why is this, right? Do we have any way to fix this? And sort of raising the issue. And I think picking something that you care about along these lines, and asking questions and trying to find any sort of small step solution can make actually a really big difference in the end. Yeah.
So one last question that was really interesting. Stephen asked, have you considered going into MD PhD?
Yeah, I never considered an MD PhD, but I actually did consider either a JD PhD or a public policy PhD. So when I applied to grad school, I applied to a slew of different things. I also applied to the Peace Corps because I wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. So yeah, so for me, I never really felt the draw to go to medical school. So I didn't consider that, but I did consider things like, maybe I want to really live at the intersection of like law and neuroscience, or public policy and neuroscience. And so I applied to some dual degree programs like that. And in the end, actually, that was really the decision for me, was, do I want to do a dual degree program, or do I want to do a pure PhD? And I decided for probably the first time in my life to like just do one thing, and just did the PhD and sort of get the scientist stamp. So yeah, I think those programs are really valuable. I think there's some really interesting examples of MD PhDs in the field. One of them is Carl Diceroff. He is one of the developers of optogenetics, and he's kind of a cool example because he has an MD PhD. He spends 1 day a week in the clinic and the other 4 days in his lab. And so he kind of does this balance. And I think you'll find that's true of a lot of different MD PhDs. So yeah, if you're someone who really wants to live at the intersection of medicine and research, and really wants to do both, and I think we do need those people, those can be really great programs. Plus you get a free MD out of it. So, free for many, many years of work.
It's funny you should mention Carl Desseros. I think he has a book coming out that we were thinking of inviting him to speak on. So it's a good note to end this on.
Nice.
So yeah, I think since we're running out of time, I just wanted to thank everyone. So thank you so much, Dr. Juavinett, for coming and for answering so many questions. I think that it was refreshing how honest your answers were, and like how broad ranging the topics were that you covered, and really helpful. I wish that I had your book when I was doing the PhD program. And I really wanted to thank everyone at the BIPOC Neuro team just for reaching out to us, for partnering with us. Mahmoud, Adrita, Amy, Alexa, it's been awesome to have you on the call and really hear a lot of different voices with questions. And also I just wanted to thank Adam and Celia, my colleagues who helped put this event together. So thank you so much. And don't forget to check out the book. And yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you all. This has been great.
Bye, guys.